Uh, Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Dr. Felix Padel to Krea University. This is a joint talk organized by Environmental Studies and Politics faculty at Krea. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the university. I don't want to say anything now because it's already late. I'm requesting my colleague, Dr. Sociology, to introduce you, and then you begin your talk. And welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It is really a privilege to invite all of you and introduce Dr. Felix Padel for this talk. As you can see, the title of the talk is Conflict over Sources of Life. Felix Padel is an anthropologist who has focused on understanding the situation of India's tribal people or Adivasis. After first degree studying classics and switching to anthropology in Oxford, he did an MPhil in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics under Andy Patele, JPS Oberoi, Leena Das, and A.M. Staff. And he made affiliated there when doing his doctorate at Oxford. This was a study in reverse anthropology about the power structure that British rule imposed over Adivasis and became his first book, Sacrificing People and Invasion of a Tribal Landscape. His next book was a study of aluminum industry worldwide from the viewpoint of Adivasi movement opposing it. The title of the book is Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and the Aluminum Party, with Summer in the Loss. And he extended this to look at India's environmental conflicts, ecology, economic quest for a socially informed connections with Ajay Dandekar and Chingal Moon, got published in 2020. He was a professor of rural management at the Indian Institute of Health Management Research in Jaipur, has taught at several universities in India, including IRMA, Vishwanath University, Santiniketan, and JNU. He now lives in Wales. An interesting fact is also, as it happens, the great grandson of Charles Darwin, and he put it in an email to us recently, and I quote, "I do feel a connection in terms of the overview that sees humankind within nature rather than separate." End of quote. And over to you, Dr. Felix. Looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you all ever so much, especially Vishnu for inviting me, and Sumyajit for helping with this, and Mukund, really wonderful to see you again after so long. So I'll go straight into the topic. The title I gave, Resource Conflicts over Sources of Life, is emphasizing the paradox that what economists and politicians and many others see as resources in an impersonal way is seen by more ancient conceptions and Adivasis and many others as the sources of life. And so maybe that's the core contradiction of capitalism, that we are devouring the ecosystems that support us. The first photograph is a photograph I took 15 years ago of, in Gandhamadan, was that mountain range in West Orissa, has bauxite on top that's never been mined, and Balco, as it was then before it was taken up by Vedanta, built a whole colony that you see there for workers, 2,000 workers to live, and it was never lived in. So this is, in a way, that's the victory of the Gandhamadan movement of the 1980s, but it's also a waste of resources. So there's many things to understand that. Just quite an evocative photo. Okay, next, please. So next slide, please. In a way, I thought of looking at this subject in terms of the four elements that many cultures take as a central way of looking at life: earth, water, fire, and air. And if you look at these, obviously the first two are to do with resources that are often being exploited or overexploited, or land grabs, or dams, or water extraction. And then fire is like the engine of the Industrial Revolution and all the factories, or the arms industry. And then air it's the element through which we communicate. So actually 5G is quite contentious at the moment, and generally the use of aircraft, the use of the air pollution also. So trying to understand, it's like a fresh way of looking at what's happening now when people are terribly worried about climate change, but hearing about global warming every day, we almost lose a sense of the urgency, and a lot of the proposals that are put forward to solve these problems don't seem very realistic. So just to go briefly through this, in terms of Earth, you can look at how common property has been undermined and individual land rights promoted. So private property, since the British in India, has really been a core value. And then you can see the whole debate between agribusiness and GM crops on one side versus organic farming on the other, the whole prices that farmers get for their foods and how they are put into debt, the whole deforestation thing, and then what's extracted from under the earth, especially carbon deposits and minerals. Then in water, people immediately think of big dams, but it's also the mining of underground aquifers, like Punjab, where the Green Revolution started. It's like 11 out of every 12 villages, I think, in Punjab are dependent on outside water now. And this doesn't only apply to India. It also applies to Australia in a major way, Middle East, USA, China, and other countries. Here in Wales, we have so much rain and it's so cold that we're not particularly we don't have such a problem with water for the moment anyway. And then, of course, the pollution of rivers and streams, apart from all the well-known ones. Vedanta had big copper mines in Zambia that polluted the river, that caused many deaths. And then also pollution of the seas that many people know about, with huge overfishing and so on. Then with fire, we'll look at the devastating forest fires that are happening. Again, luckily not so much in India, but many other countries have had terrible ones recently, partly as the land is drying out and the underground aquifers or the water sources are becoming challenged. But there's also, if you think of fire at the center of the earth, like our earth is so solid, and yet we know at the core of it there is fire. And there's a kind of, we depend on sunlight for life too, which is a form of fire. But above all, in the Industrial Revolution, maybe like water and land have been desacralized, fire also, we just take it for granted. Whenever we switch on an electric light or start a car, we are using a form of fire that often we take for granted and don't understand very much. And then above all, in the arms industry, the kind of extreme form of the use of fire. Then with air, as I mentioned, pollution of cities in Delhi and others is very well known now. Also, especially the air pollution around mines and factories, the dust and toxic pollution, the industrial diseases. I often wonder why no scientists look at how climate change is happening around a thermal power plant or a factory, because the heating that is happening there, local people are very aware. It should be easier to measure than the worldwide particles that are so contentious in climate science. So that would be one thing I'd like to highlight. But why isn't local climate change highlighted? It seems partly because it would question this model of industrialization that, in a way, the left as well as the right take for granted as the only way that is recognized of development. And then 5G, pollution in the airwaves, possible health risks, actually very well authenticated health risks, although they're often denied. And of course, the air too leads to surveillance and surveillance capitalism, or whatever it's called. The way we communicate is through the airwaves, how we're doing it now in a way that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide is just a very brief overall argument that I give here. One to do with the concept of economics and the concept of ecology, and what it means that we take economic growth for granted as the symbol of a country's well-being. Then the other is you often see the whole thing of displacement of Adivasis, not just Adivasis, many people by so-called development projects. It's often called development-induced displacement. And I've coined a term, and others are starting to use it, investment-forced displacement, because it's always investment that is forcing the displacement, if you look at it. Obviously, indigenous people, Adivasis and other people are on the front line. So in this displacement and other things, there is a process of one can call cultural genocide. Then one of the concepts that indigenous people have evolved, especially in Latin America, is the rights of nature or the rights of Mother Earth. But there's a conflict, especially in India, but other places too, between conservationists and Adivasis in that. And then number 5, the militarization of resource conflicts, which we know too well in India. But there's also, in a way, what you could call, or what some people see as a war on nature, as the basis for the military-industrial complex, because all the minerals for aerospace, for weapons, they come obviously from mining and so on. Okay, next one. Next slide. So this is what fascinates me is the two words economics and ecology come from the same root of ecos is the ancient Greek word for house. Nomos is law, logos is logic. So the law of correct housekeeping, the logic of correct housekeeping, they should mean almost the same thing. But of course, economists don't study, are not asked to study ecosystems and how ecology works. Next slide. So my most recent book was called Ecology, Economy, Quest for a Socially Informed Connection. And the second chapter there is called Adivasi Economics, because in many ways, of course, not in all ways, but Adivasi society is based on an ecological awareness that's in tune with long-term sustainability, worked out in extensive systems of ecological knowledge. This is true of tribal and indigenous societies worldwide. Intrinsic in the social structure of most tribal societies is a complex, subtle balance between ecology and economy. This is not to idealize tribal societies. They, like others, they have many faults in them, but there is this far greater sense of an ecological awareness than we are used to in our society, because they live from the nature that they depend on. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah, I think I'm going to go quite quickly through this, just to say the concept of economic growth. If you see how people have tried to question it from ecological economics, you have concepts like the steady state economy, an economy that is steady rather than expanding, and the idea of degrowth. So many people, especially the environmental ecological economist Juan Martinez Alia in Spain, he talks about, we should be aiming at degrowth, which is of course something one cannot say in politics or often to an economist. So industrialization at the center of it. Let's carry on. Next slide, please. So I think this is just basically what I said before. Let's carry on. Next slide. This is just a house of the Missing tribe, MISING, in Assam, just as a very beautiful idea of ecos. What is a house? What is how you can see how many of the materials there are taken from nature. Next. So this is the basic question. How is continuous economic growth possible when natural resources are limited, water systems are badly damaged already by extractive industries? Is economic growth desirable if its human costs are too high for those displaced or suffering inhuman labor conditions? Do present policies of industrial growth make sense economically, or do they depend on hidden subsidies? Studying the aluminium industry in particular, we saw it's dependent on vast subsidies for the cost of electricity, the cost of infrastructure, cutting corners in labor and compensation, and many, many other ways. And then finally, is economic growth actually built on debt and black money that is oriented to war? That's an overview of the capitalist system where the trade in arms is, as it were, economists don't usually study it because it's too sensitive, I guess, but often they are the biggest deals that are being made between countries. Next slide, please. So this is a book by an American, Richard Heinberg, The End of Growth, Adapting to Our New Economic Reality. And I quite like this sentence. So it's very confronting. The economic crisis that began in 2008 was both foreseeable and inevitable, and it marked a permanent fundamental break from past decades, a period during which most economists adopted the unrealistic view that perpetual growth is necessary and possible. So very much have to question the whole concept of what is a developed or a underdeveloped or a developing country, that in some sense, in many material ways, India developed long before, for example, Britain did. And now these three categories of developed, developing, and underdeveloped, at first they were used by Marxists, but now they are standard practice of the World Bank to divide not just countries, but regions within countries into. And it's a very biased, very distorting lens to look at things through. Next slide, please. But of course, very hard to question because we're so used to it. This is again quoting Heinberg. The transition to a no-growth economy, or one in which growth is defined in a fundamentally different way, is inevitable. But it will go much better if we plan for it, rather than simply watch in dismay as institutions we have come to rely on fail, and then improvise a survival strategy in their absence. So Amit Bhadouri is one Indian economist who I've worked with a little bit, who's really talked about how economic growth often increases poverty rather than what the World Bank mindset assumes of reducing poverty. Next slide, please. This is just to say that these questions are quite old. Henry George wrote this book in 1879, Progress and Poverty. And George was considered more radical than Marx, but he's been completely forgotten about, partly because a lot of, really more than a dozen key economists formulated their theories against what he was saying, but without actually naming him. So in a way, writing him out of economics history. This is from a book that I think is very good by Francis Hutchinson, Understanding the Financial System, Social Credit Rediscovered. Next. So, okay, starting with the element of earth. And by the way, so you have some reference points. The earth and water sections here are quite long sections. The fire and air are much shorter sections. So this is all over India. These wastelands of mined areas are developing, and there's very little emphasis on it. Even people in cities usually don't see this, especially in Jharkhand. This is Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and Orissa and some other states. Okay, next. very often, this is one I photographed in Jharkhand a few years ago. You can understand how the underwater aquifers are damaged. And of course, you can see right at the edge, this was all complete forest and intact ecosystem before the coal was mined. Now that you've mined it, you know, there are people trying to rehabilitate these sites in terms of socially as well as probably ecologically, but very, very difficult. Next, please. So especially Adani projects. Chitranga Chowdhury is somebody who's written about Adani coal projects in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh and Orissa. This is just some references to her articles. So I hope you can all have these links afterwards. Next, please. This is just one relatively small coal mine in North Jharkhand, where there was shock at police firing or some conflict over the coal mine. Next. This is not an Adani one, by the way. Next. And just, I mean, this is a common sight, you know, we see such things only in remote areas, often not on the screen. Next. But it's so normal for many villagers now. So this is like the kind of collective labor that still does happen on the land in places where Adivasis and others still have the rights over the land. I mean, the contrast with the previous photograph is obvious. Okay, next. And next slide shows, I think, an Adivasi house of the Santals. People often talk about them still as kind of huts or thatcha houses or something, when different tribes vary, but often they're very, very beautifully made and very beautifully painted like this too. A lot of dignity, and you can see the use of natural resources in the different clays and so on. Next. This is protest, I think, again in the Hazaribagh area. I mean, such Adivasi protests, very little coordinated over India by the National Alliance of People Movements, but there is some coordination. But on the whole, there are literally, obviously, hundreds of such protests throughout the country, and obviously many, many other countries too. Next. This is just one of the world's biggest mines for copper and gold by Freeport in West Papua. Just a vast hole in the middle of a mountain. To bear in mind that actually in Latin America and New Guinea and other places, there are even much bigger in terms of size of some of these, especially copper mines are often vast like this. Next one, please. And this is just about the illegal mining. I guess most of you here have heard of the Shah Commission. It worked just for about 2 years, and then it was closed down when it began to work on very sensitive things. And it's interesting how even British MPs are shareholders of some of the companies, like interlocking companies. Next slide, please. This is the standing stones that were built to commemorate the dozen Adivasis who were killed in police firing on the 2nd of January 2006 in Orissa for the Tata Steel plant. Next, please. So this is just a very broad overview for people who like statistics, highlighting here Orissa, Chhattisgarh, and Jharkhand, how many of the core minerals in India are in these states. Quite interesting. The chromite mines in Orissa, in Sukinda, are said to be one of the most polluted places on Earth. Next slide, please. So looking at the concentration of mineral deposits and projects in India. Next slide. And this is the ST percentage. So you can see in Chhattisgarh, there's a very high percentage, and obviously in Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, Jharkhand, and so on. Next. This is my aluminium book, which really tried to make a holistic analysis of the aluminium industry from the point of view of the Adivasi movements against it, but looking at the whole of it industry and its history worldwide. And one of the things that fascinated us there, especially, this was thanks to the Wuppertal Institute, which was an institute in Germany that looks at resource uses, how producing 1 ton of steel consumes over 40 tons of water, producing 1 ton of aluminium consumes over 1,000 tons of water. So as Britain, during the time we were writing the book, Britain was closing, and other countries, other so-called developed countries, were closing their last steel plants and aluminium smelters, just as they're being opened in India. So India has the appearance of overtaking, and obviously in GDP, it's really overtaking Britain, but at what cost to the resources, to the water aquifers and people's lives? Next. This was a diagram that is central to what we did in that book, looking at how the bauxite mine and mountain, conveyor belt to alumina refinery, then rail or road to smelter, rail or road then to ship. And sometimes you have some of those things located next to each other. And then to support the refinery and smelter factories, every single one has a dam, a big dam that's specially built for that. Many people don't realize how closely metal production and dams are linked. And everyone also has a captive coal-fired power plant, and usually also captive coal mines. So just to understand how these industries are absolutely linked, the building of infrastructure by loans from the World Bank or other organizations for road or rail, and so on and so on. The coal industry itself was supported by the World Bank a lot. Next. One more big coal mine this would be servicing the Balco Vedanta refinery smelter in the town of Korba in Chhattisgarh. And you can see that the scale of it, like some of these mines are nearly 1 kilometer deep and some are 30 square kilometers or something or more. The lorries are visible just down there. Next. And this is the conveyor belts, 22 kilometers long, from Panchpat Mali, which is still, I think, India's biggest bauxite mine, to the alumina refinery at Damanjodi in Krea district. And you can see the desiccation of landscape there, which has many causes, but especially the mining of bauxite itself, because bauxite acts as a sponge on the mountain. So when it's mined as a source of water, a mountain is dead after that. So the land all around Damanjodi is very, very dry and desiccated like this. Next. And the village, in terms of a picture, this looks quite nice, but actually, I think I've rarely been to a more impoverished village. So this is a village where a lot of the men walk up to the top of the mountain every day to try to get a job doing the bauxite mining, and a lot of alcoholism there and so on. Next. It's also in that village, I remember a man saying how the last bear that was seen there, he shot himself, that the kind of disrespect for nature or the hunting or deforestation is something at a certain point Adivasis do themselves when they understand the respect for those things has ceased to exist. This was a very revealing advert by Vedanta for the bauxite conveyor belts they built in near Lanjigar from Niyamgiri, but they never used. But mining happiness for the people of Orissa. It's an amazing phrase they used there. Next. So obviously the book is looking at the history of Niyamgiri. I won't go into that much now, but the Gram Sabhas were very historical. And what one Adivasi woman I knew said, we need the mountain and the mountain needs us. Amaku bahar dorkar achi or baharku ame dorkar achi. It's just such a simple way of understanding the symbiosis between people and mountain. Next. This is the Lanjigar refinery as it was being built with Niyamgiri in the backdrop. You can move on. Next, please. And this is around the same time you see the Niyamgiri mountain. They were not able to mine for bauxite. So they built the refinery there, but there's no way they could, they're having to get bauxite. They even got it from Gujarat at one point. They were getting it from Chhattisgarh, and they were now getting it from another mountain in South Orissa. Next. This is Dongria cowherd right in the top of the mountain, where one of the special things about these mountains is you've got forest on the actual top, and you've got a kind of taboo on the cutting of that forest. Although they cut the hill slopes, they leave the forest as sacred to Niyam Raja, as one understands it. Next. Amazing trees on this is on the hill slip going up, photographed about 15 years ago. Next. And this is the Dongria Kond sacred conception. This is actually a temple. The triangles represent basically earth and water, like the almost like the Taoist symbol of yin and yang. Next. Okay, Niyamgiri, next. This is the film my co-author Samarendra made called Earthworm Company Man, which is, I don't think it's ever been released. I think you would have to get it through him, but very powerful footage of all to do with the bauxite mining and aluminium in Orissa. Next. And yeah, that picture was actually a Dongria shaman woman who allowed him to film her as she was coming out of trance, so quite unusual. And again, big contrast. This is Adivasis doing bauxite mining for Vedanta in central Chhattisgarh, again, about 15 years ago. Next. Most of these people are of the Baiga tribe, and their villages are nearby. And again, they're really drying out. Next. Next. This is in Korba, the aluminium smelter. And next. And the finished project, the nice shiny aluminium. Okay, next. This is where Vedanta is trying to mine next, which is a bauxite cap mountain called Kantwamali in Kalahandi district. And people there are opposed. It's also an elephant corridor. And this is a test pit they dug years ago. So there is still resistance there. Next. And you can see the mountain on the top again. And this is about how, this is from 7 years ago, just an article about how they're likely to get that. Next. And this is the amazing fertile landscape around that Contour Mali. You can see the lushness of water. So the base rock of the mountains in Orissa and North Andhra Pradesh are called condolites, and they were named after the Kond tribe. And many people commented how fertile the land is around these mountains, and that's the first devastation, that when you mine the bauxite, the land from being very fertile becomes desiccated because the perennial streams don't run in the summer. Next. This is one little remote village just underneath the mountain. Next. Another lovely view from that village. Next. So water. This is again Niyamgiri, and just shows the kind of again symbiosis with nature of people just crossing the river or coming to get water from the river that is just flowing through the mountains. Next. And then again, this is the contrast. This is in Cordoba. You can imagine this river going through an industrial city like Cordoba is not exactly going to be drinkable and very dangerous for washing in, or for animals also too, probably. Next. And this is interesting. For every ton they make of alumina, they get 2.5 tons of red mud. So it's waste. It's toxic. It's radioactive, and you have huge, often several square kilometers around an alumina refinery, and it's never ever supposed to leach into water. But you can see it's overflowed, and so as soon as the monsoon rain comes, it will overflow into that stream. Next. And this is boys who are flying kites on you can just see the extent of these wastelands that are there. Never mind. Next, please. Again, coming to the opposite level of water, this is in Gantamadan again, and you can see, you know, the water wealth that is coming down from a mountain like this, of amazing waterfalls. We'll come back to that. Next. This is a closer view of that colony I showed in the first slide. Next. And a closer view of the waterfall. Next. So coming to iron ore and the steel industry, North Orissa, huge areas of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, Saranda Forest in Jharkhand, Raugat in Chhattisgarh, these are all very, very contested areas. Next. Orissa's biggest iron ore and manganese mine is somewhere called Kurmitar Mines, associated with Kandatara, which is Orissa's highest waterfall. It's in Sundargarh district in North Orissa. And actually this was left out by the Shah Commission, and I think this because it's very connected politically. And the POSCO, you probably will have heard of the POSCO movement in Orissa that stopped the POSCO steel plant. But what people don't know was originally POSCO didn't even want to build a steel plant, but what they really wanted was the manganese and iron ore. And when we went to the mine up there, which is above this waterfall, people told us already the manganese ore is being sent to Krea. So what you read in the newspapers and what a movement even knows is sometimes there's a deeper story. Next. And this is, in America, they have a term, mountaintop removal. If you see on the right-hand side there, those white lines are where lorries are driving along to do the mining. So vast scale of that. And then if you move along to the left, you see it was forested just before. And the Pauri Bhuya are so-called special, what used to be called primitive tribal group, who were moved out of the forest. Again, they were doing real agroforestry there and growing fruit trees and so on, and then moved out of there because they were deemed to be unsustainable. But obviously the real reason was because they wanted to mine it. Next. This is the top of the waterfall. Next. You can see the amazing forests all around it. And this is looking up from a pool below it. And these black and red stripes apparently are iron and manganese. And you have very good quality iron and manganese there. Next. So it comes into this amazing pool at the bottom. Next. 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 You can see the colors well there. Next. And this is a village with a canal that used to have some water from this river that's coming down the mountain, and now it's completely dry. So next, the next slide shows how the villages are explaining that, how they used to have water, and now there's no water, and they're dependent on truck deliveries of water. And these are resettled Pauripuya. Next. So all these people who have been displaced by dams, in the case of Pauripuya, just for mines itself, often for factories. So huge conflicts. Next. So I once met the top engineer of the Sarasara Dam, who was speaking at a conference in Gujarat, and he admitted that none of the places where the Sarasara water was meant to go did it reach. Especially, it didn't reach in Saurashtra. It was basically captured by the new city of Gandhinagar and by many new factories and so on. So what dams are supposedly built for and what they're really built for, there's often a big contrast. At that time, there was a big plan for a sea dam on the Gulf of Kambat that I was involved in looking at, but I don't think it's going ahead. Next. This is an article in The Wire about the demonstrations, like threatening to drown themselves by the people affected by Sarasara, which probably 250,000 people have been at least negatively affected by that dam. Next. This is a film made by my friend Subrat Kumar Sahu. He's actually made 2 films about dams, one in Orissa, and this one's about dams in Himachal Pradesh. Very, very, very shocking to really see what's really happening with the details of the dams. That one drives through Himachal, it's, we all know, so beautiful, but the reality of what's happening there is another story. Next. Obviously, the technology of drilling the tunnels through the mountains is incredibly advanced, but often they don't know much about the real impacts environmentally or let alone socially. This is another dam I was involved with called the Ilisu Dam in Turkey, in the Kurdish region. And this is a very ancient city that has now been flooded. I went there just before it was flooded. So the next view is about that. So you can understand a little bit of the war in Syria and Iraq in relation to this. That next slide. Next. This was my photo. This is as part of what they built in preparation for the flooding of the dam gates being closed, that you can see how most of the town will be closed, and they built this huge concrete structure. Next. And this is why it's so important politically that the Tigris and Euphrates, you probably all know that civilization developed first in these areas of the world, and these 2 rivers are pretty much dammed by Turkey now, so the water isn't flowing into Rojava, Syria, and into Iraq. So especially the Kurdish regions are real conflict zones now. Next. This is just a detail of showing the Ilisu Dam within South Turkey. Next. This is my photo from the top part of that city of Hasan Cave, just looking at the Tigris River. It was amazing to see it, but very, very sad to see a place that's about to be destroyed. Next. Well, this is an issue that we all know much more about. At least we read articles about it, even if it's quite remote from us. But the plastic in the sea, the pollutants of the sea. Yes, next slide, please. Alang shipyard is very famous in Gujarat for, at least they're reprocessing ships, but huge pollution comes through that. Next. Similar, yes, with this overshipping, overfishing. I did a whole study for the Gujarat Ecological Society about the impacts of the coastal fishing. And it's in a way amusing and shocking to realize we think of sharks as so dangerous, but every year about 6 people are killed by them. And if you can believe it, something like 100 million sharks are killed by humans for shark fin soup and other things. Next. Similarly with coral reefs, the causes are quite complex. But for example, in the Gulf of Kutch, where we studied them a bit, they are in quite a bad state. And I've seen them around the Andaman Islands, and there's a lot of bleaching there. Great Barrier Reef in Australia. So this is a marine biologist who says coral reefs are the ocean's canaries, and we must see what's happening to them. Next. I think the most beautiful thing I've ever seen on Earth is a coral reef that I saw in a couple of places in the Red Sea. So this is some of my studies, flamingos on Gujarat's coastline. It's a very unusual coastline because you have the sea is moving several kilometers every day up and down. So it's very, very rich. These mudflats are incredibly rich for bird life. Next. And mangroves. And here you see one of the several new coal-fired power plants built along the coast. This is on the Gulf of Kutch. Next. And this is fishermen who are living near there, mostly Muslim fishermen, and doing the small scale fishing, were obviously being impacted by the trawlers too. Next. But you can imagine the effluents from this factory and the factories. This is just to look at water in another way, that so much of trade is happening by sea now, and there's huge complexity in that, which I'm not going to go into now, but just to bear in mind it's there. And one of the things Gandhi, I remember, said was, it's best if food is mostly consumed close to where it's produced. And especially in Britain now, like only a tiny percentage of our food is produced by us. And maybe that's true of parts of India too. Next. Okay, we're coming to near the end now. So the element of fire. This is actually a photo of the Kalinganagar firing again, the 12 Adivasis who were initially killed by the police firing in 2006. And obviously in India, the element of fire has this sacredness to it, which is maybe kind of one of our primary connections with fire. Next. So this is the forest fires. Terrible in Australia, Brazil, Siberia, Portugal, Spain, France, Greece, African countries, many countries, these forest fires are getting out of control, and there are many causes for it. But part of it is what I said, that the earth itself is drying up as the aquifers go. Next. So this is just to look at two very key books about the arms trade here, because obviously the arms industry and trade is what brings to an apex this extractive economy that we have all taken for granted now. Next. So this is just about living in the UK. It's never made an issue here. None of the political parties question that the main role of the UK in terms of how we earn our living on the world stage is by exporting weapons, and it's not a good way to earn our living. In fact, it's 100 years ago or 90 years ago that in the League of Nations after the First World War, a motion was brought to stop the sale of weapons for private profit. Can you imagine such a thing? It's very hard to imagine anybody even thinking of that now. And the Times newspaper in London carried the headline, "It was realized that war is not only a terrible, but a terribly profitable thing." So, you know, even the war in Ukraine, how many British and American and other companies are getting huge amounts of profits, unprecedented by this terrible human suffering there. Next. This is just to go back in ancient history and see how closely connected since ancient times, the beginning of coinage, beginning of what we could call money, is with war. So the first coins, these were made in Turkey around 2,600 years ago, were apparently to pay Greek mercenaries. So very interesting. Next. The next coin is an Athenian silver 10 drachma piece, and you see the symbol of the goddess and her symbol, the owl. Very nice. But Athens was becoming a bit of an empire then herself, and the paying for the wars is in relation to the money they were coining. Next. Of course, this copper, gold, silver has lasted ever since, you know, for 2,500 years, but now we came to paper money and now electronic money. So, but still the links happen through entities like BlackRock, which you probably know is the world's biggest asset management fund. And it's where it invests, it's invested in all the top world's mining companies, but also in things like drone warfare technology, and it certainly invested a lot in the Iraq and probably Ukrainian wars. And when the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, went for the first time to Britain in 2014, probably the most influential person he met there was not Barack Obama, it was Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who was promising more investment in India. Next. This is the meeting as it happened then. Next. And this is just about US military bases, and you can imagine the money spent on that. It's like, can we actually develop the art of peace, or is it always war and military technology that is really driving what we have learned to call development? Next. And this is a contradiction I love to come to, that Alfred Nobel was basically an arms salesman. And the Swedish company Bofors was originally an iron ore company, a steel company, and he turned it into an arms company. And he specialized in selling often to both sides in a war. And then the headline came in French, Le Marchand de la Guerre, de la Mort est mort, the merchant of death is dead. And he hadn't really died. It was his brother, I think, who died. but he was so sad at that he started the Peace Prize. But for us, getting the Nobel Prize is like we've taken it as such a gold standard of excellence and integrity, when its start was anything but integrity. Next. So coming back to the aerospace, this is a particular kind of aircraft, just to, in Britain it was called Red Arrows for a time. And this is J.K. Galbraith, who was, the American economist who was ambassador to India in 1965, when he said the war at that time, the arms we supplied caused the war. If we hadn't supplied the arms to Pakistan, they wouldn't have sought the one thing we wanted to avoid, a military solution. So how often Britain and America and other countries have been selling to both sides. Next. So these Red Arrows are a particular kind of plane that then Hal in Koraput, the factory in Orissa, started making. And next photo. I think in that war, one of them was captured by Pakistan and put on display in Karachi Museum. Next. So this is obviously the latest things that hit us through the air. Obviously not us. We live, whether you're in Andhra Pradesh or UK, we're relatively safe, but in the whole of Kurdistan, in Yemen, in so many parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, drone warfare can hit people at any time. Next. This is the 5G issue, which I won't go into now, but I've seen a lot of health studies that say it can be really dangerous, especially for not just for humans, but also other animals, and especially bees. Next. And those lines you see there, what they call the Internet of Things, involved these this plan for a grid, obviously encircling the Earth. It's one thing to know that, but to understand the details of it and what often happens next to the towers is another thing. Next. So mass radiation, geoengineering, these are very controversial subjects, but just to show a little bit what we don't usually see of that. Next. So just the concluding passage here, and then I hope to have questions from you. Extractivism, to me, is a much better concept than the COP26-27 process that's happened in Glasgow and Egypt. To me, has been very, very troubling to witness indeed, because a lot of the solutions being offered to me are real phony solutions. One would be the electric car, which demands a whole new range of cars, all using new aluminium that is fused with plastic and unrecyclable. People don't talk about that, as well as the lithium, which is very damaging in other ways to the environment. So extractivism is in some ways a more solid concept, and it's what's not being talked about in the COP process of the actual extraction of mineral resources, fossil fuels, as well as water. So because this, in a way, the Marxists, to me, haven't critiqued, as they should have, this concept of development, underdevelopment. The concept of underdevelopment was first used by Harry Truman in 1949, I think. So they also take the industrialization process as the norm, which is why a lot of the Marxist parties in India, some do, but piecemeal, but on the whole, the CPIN hasn't supported these movements. And same with Extinction Rebellion, like very popular movement on climate change, but it's often not going to especially the nitty-gritty of the mining and metal production. Next. So this is the rights of nature concept, which has been used increasingly in different places as against the overexploitation, the this again, Chitranga Chaudhary has written about the land banks and the Compensation Afforestation Fund Act. Next. This is by my very close friend Madhu Ramnath, who lives in Tamil Nadu, but has worked a lot in especially Chhattisgarh and Orissa. So about the very, very poignant issue of sometimes conservationists seem very anti-Adivasi, because it's as if the wild spaces in India, the forests, there are over 500 national parks and sanctuaries, and it's as if they've done a deal with the mining companies. Okay, you take the rest. But of course, Adivasis have moved out of the sanctuaries often, as well as they are obviously displaced by the mining projects. This is Dongria Cons. Next. So this is the Gaia Foundation. Gaia is the ancient Greek word for earth as a living being, understanding it as a living being. So can we move beyond extractivism? When you see something like this, I don't even know where this is, probably Latin America. Next. This is with two Adivasi activist women from the village of Kuchapada who were visiting Gantamartan. This is actually behind the waterfall we saw. There's a little footpath that goes behind it. So this urgent need in India for conservationists and tribal rights activists to work together, because they both understand many aspects of it, but the full understanding, the full kind of in Niyamgiri, people ask, why did the Niyamgiri movement succeed? One reason was because conservationists did come together there with tribal rights activists. Next. Or is that the last one? Yeah, this is the last one. So this is a group in Latin America. I'm afraid I'm not sure where the rights of nature keep the oil in the soil, keep this is especially in Ecuador. This became a mantra to try to have a movement where the oil is there, but it's not going to be extracted. And I was linking this in the last bit with an article there about an issue I've written a lot about in the last 5 years, to do with mining company funded tribal education that really is a form of brainwashing. Okay, well, I hope none of you feel brainwashed, and it's great you're all you've come to listen to me. So please give any questions. I think you can stop screen sharing now.
Yeah, can you hear me? Felix, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it was really an entertaining talk and covering such a huge array of topics. Actually, there are students who are doing a course for ecological economics and teaching in the classroom. And so I'm sure like the kind of the broad overview that you have provided will definitely get to ask some questions. So maybe I have a few questions myself, but I will talk it for later. I will open questions, so anyone on Zoom can put it on chat, or use your raise hand feature to directly speak. I will ask anyone from the classroom to ask any questions if they have. You can raise your hand and I pass you the mic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit worried about not hearing any questions somebody asked, because there is this.
So far, no one has asked anything.
You can write it in chat maybe as or a short form of
I
it.
will pass on the mic. So I think they're still.
Ah, good. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe I'll just go ahead and ask my question first. I'm sorry that you're not able to see me because I'm behind the camera. So So see, I think this debate of that we need for development we need material, and for material we need to extract them, and oftentimes when we have to extract material, the people who are at the receiving end are who are marginalized in the society, which in this case you have shown the tribal and the other marginalized communities. But what I want to ask you this, well, I am also very well aware about the degrowth movement, and there are various other alternative developmental movements that are going on. But how are you going to make that shift? Why I say this question, I will try to kind of elaborate. See, it's not only that this material world, which has happened because of the fossil fuel and because of the material, availability or extraction, as you rightly so, has given us material conveniences and material, not only conveniences, but I would go on to argue material freedom and freedom of choice. And that freedom of choice has almost become synonymous with the neoliberal value or the liberal value that we are upholding in today's time. So if I because my research also slightly sees upper class individual in India and how they aspire to live the life of the West, and that is true for even if you go to various remote parts of India. So how are we going to convince them to go for a lower standard of life, where it is not only just the material conveniences, but it is also the sacrifice of their notion, their very ability to choose, and therefore a notion of material freedom. Is a real question that I am also kind of dealing with in my research in my limited capacity, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, thank you so much. It's obviously a fundamental question. And as I mentioned, I've looked a lot at the issue of tribal education. And if you see what has been so shocking is to realize from a huge range of scholars who've written about it sensitively, as well as going and talking to teachers and students in different tribal schools in different states. Like, in a way, what you meet in most tribal schools in India, and there are some exceptions, but very few and far between, is what I would call cultural racism. That the choices that are presented to people are choices completely at variance with their own society. So it's often commented that, like, an interview with a tribal man in Jharkhand, of the Oraon tribe, when he's saying, this education is not our education. You're educating them into your system, Babu. When they come out of school, they're useless to us, these children, because they look down on us who work with our hands. They look down on us because all our knowledge is oral tradition. So in a sense, from that point of view, it's false choices. So when you look at the value system of a traditional Adivasi village, like I used to see 30 years ago, and now you can hardly see that traditional village, but all the aspirations there are on local things in the community. All the aspirations now for children who've been to school is to become the doctor, the engineer, the school teacher, the things within the system, because a salary and the moneyed economy has obviously become far, far more important. But also the cultural racism has become, if anything, even more. But I mean, that's the question for Adivasis, which, again, it's not for us to, in a sense, interfere in that. There is brainwashing in, especially KISS, the world's biggest boarding school in the world, has 30,000 tribal children in, and they all are very regimented in what they wear and what they can do. So I would say there's real brainwashing there, that then the choices they're given, to some extent, are a false choice, because one article I wrote about with somebody who interviewed a teenage boy who had been in KISS for years, for 10 years or so, but then he was also part of the anti-Mali Parbat bauxite mining movement that's going on now in Krea district, Orissa. And for being part of that movement, he was put in jail. And then he did an interview saying, actually, it made me realize KISS was like a jail. The school was like a jail, the boarding school. We're told to be very thankful for our education and all it gives us, but actually we're really controlled by it. So what is real choice in a situation where there's so much brainwashing? And then coming back to our situation, what we take for granted, like in any lecture room in a university, you often see these electric lights are on all the time. We just take so much consumption of electricity for granted. And that's just one of so many assumptions we make that, yes, it's nice to have the choice to put on electric lights and you can see at night, but we're not taught what are the costs of that choice or anything. And then there's so many other things we take for granted there. So it's like in India, especially, the standard of living for middle class people is still going up. But for how long can it sustain when the water and so on is the ecosystems are becoming really challenged? And I suppose that what I'm trying to do here is just give an overview so that we actually get an overview of the whole system from our economic system and what's not talked about, like the arms industry, to, where our food comes from and everything. Thank you.